Welcome to our Tuesday takeover. After that election season, we took a little break, but we are back. I hope you're all staying dry. Where I am right now, it's raining. We needed the rain in California, so it's good to have some rain. So, welcome to our Tuesday takeover. Before we start today's meeting, I wanted us to have our land acknowledgement. We do this at the start of our CTA and NEA meetings. So it's a chance for us to ground in and think of those that walked on the land that we currently reside. So I am currently on Ohlone land. I am up here in the Bay Area. In the chat, there will be a link if you don't know. You can look up right there, the native land, who were the native people that walked on the land that you are on now. And it's just a chance to bring them into this space and think that where we are was not what it looked like. So, and if you want, if you look up on the link, you can put in the chat who were the native people in where you are right now. You want to add that in the chat. Welcome, welcome. For those that have just joined us, there's a link in the chat in which you can look up who were the native people that were on the land that you are right now. And that's what we're having people put into the chat. Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Alberto Nodal. I am a bilingual kindergarten teacher in San Lorenzo, up in the Bay Area. I am the chair of the Hispanic Caucus and co-chair of REAC. REAC is the Racial Equity Advisory Committee or Affairs Committee. So before we start, if you are following us on social media, you could use the hashtag CTA for Justice, capital CTA, capital J, just so that it doesn't all get lost. Also, I'm going to hold up this little stick just so that if you wonder why I'm doing this, this is to let the panelists know that they are at time so that we can move on, because we have a lot of questions that we want to get through. And in order to hear from everyone, we want to get through our agenda. So if you see me doing this, that's what that's for. So I will let our panelists introduce themselves. But first, before we do that, I want them to think of, they're going to tell you their name, what they do in education, and then I'd also like them to tell us how they identify and why that's important to them. So their name, what they do in education, how they identify, and why that's important to them. So we're going to start off with Mary.
To do like my kids, find that little button. Hi. Wow, I wasn't expecting to be first, but hello, I'm Mary Levi, Hopi from Northern Arizona, but a fourth grade teacher down here in Upland, California, in the South, Upland Unified School District. I've been teaching for 30 years. I identify, I'm also the American Indian Alaska Native Caucus Chair for CTA. The way I identify is depending on who I am speaking to first. If I was among a Native community, my first would be I am Hopi. I am the daughter of a snow clan. I come from Shngolpavi. And these are all ways that I identify. People get, the outside and get further in. I am, for those when I'm out in rural areas or suburban areas or, in the cities, I identify as Native American first, and then I identify with my tribe as Hopi, and then my clanship, and then my family. Why I identified this way is because Hopi is the center of who I am. Hopi is not just the title and name of the tribe that I come from, but it is my religious thought process. It is my daily lively, the way I walk on this earth, the way I view the plants and the animals that I see as I'm going off to work. Hopi is central to my whole thought process from morning until night. And that was the way I was raised. That was the way I raised my children and my family. And that's why when I identify as Hopi, that's why it's so important. Native American is a very big, broad, and that's when people just who don't understand tribal names and tribal sovereignty, that's where I go. That's where I am.
Perfect. Thank you, Mary. Next up, Nicole.
Hello. My name is Nicole DeVore. Thank you for calling on me next. So I teach here in Sacramento. I'm a classroom teacher. I teach 4th grade. Sometimes I've taught 5th. I kind of bounce back and forth. That's my love. That age. I general education, not special ed or any, just general education. And I do teach in Sacramento City. We have quite a few large school districts here in the Sacramento area, but I actually teach in Sacramento City. And I have for 23 years. What do I do in CTA? Well, I currently am co-chair of the SOJAC caucus, which SOJAC, for those people who do not know, SOJAC stands for, help me if I get this wrong, Alberto, Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity Issues Affairs Committee?
Yep, you got it.
Okay, all those extra letters. I mean, right? So that's anyway. So we meet as a committee to try to work on issues and concerns for the LGBTQ plus people, whether it be sometimes student oriented, sometimes but a lot of times member oriented. I also I'm on state council. I've been let's see, I think that's about all of the CTA stuff. How do I identify? I identify as a female. I am, it's kind of one of those funny things with the LGBTQ community, right? I actually identify and I use the pronouns she, her, and I try to put those after my name, just so that you would know. I know that sometimes, especially because I am masculine presenting, and yes, when I dress up, I tend to dress more towards, you know, wearing the bow ties or ties and suit jackets. I have and I can wear a dress. I just am not nearly as comfortable in that. But it is important, and I do identify as a woman. There are many people in my community that don't necessarily feel female or male, and we can talk about that in a little bit. But I definitely identify as a female. So we might use the term cis. I'm cisgender, and I believe, is that about all we're supposed to talk about? I think that's all we're supposed to talk about, right?
Yeah, that's fine. Right. Thank you. Okay. Estella.
Sa alo falava, alo uingo Estella Wima Church. Greetings. I'm Estella Wima Church. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I teach high school theater at Roy Ball Learning Center in downtown Los Angeles. My local is UTLA, and I am your NEA APIC SoCal Regional Director, so Asian Pacific Islander Caucus at the NEA level. Otisau Mai, Los Angeles, Yala, Savai, Samoa, and Calabar, Nigeria. So I'm an Angelino, but my roots are in Samoa and in Nigeria. I identify as Black, Pacifica, Samoan American, Nigerian American, and Angelino. My city is a big part of my identity. I no longer feel the need to minimize any parts of those identities based on how folks outside of me choose to raise me. And each of those parts of my identity are super important to mention, to name, to acknowledge for a few reasons. For one, the road traveled to get to that point has been a very long, hard process. And I'm sure anyone who has had an identity crisis can relate at some point. As a matter of fact, the process is still ongoing to really connect to my indigenous roots as Samoan or as Nigerian. Two, I want to be very intentional about bringing forth my ancestors in any space that I have the privilege to occupy. Like anytime I invoke my name, I do that. And most importantly, I am finally realizing that my personal liberation and the way I choose to identify and how I've come to that, those realizations is tied, it's linked to the liberation of the kids that I serve. And so the more I'm able to understand and communicate who I am, where I come from, then I'm better equipped to facilitate liberating spaces for students where they get to also go on their own identity journey and develop into whoever they are supposed to be and all of that they're supposed to be. So I get to be myself, but then students and I get to co-construct affirming learning environments.
Perfect. Thank you. Van Cedric, if you'd like to go next.
Wow, I just want to give Estella lots of shout outs for that. That is so powerful. Go ahead, sister. Go ahead. That's all love. My name is Van Cedric Williams. Identify he, him, his, cisgender male, and African American. Let's see, I'll get back to the African American part. I am with United Educators in San Francisco. I'm a 17-year teacher, 3-year treasurer for the Teachers Union, and newly elected board member, director to Oakland Unified School District. Yes. I can't believe it. I did it. Oh, we did it. So it is so awesome. So much love from CTA, from Oakland OEA, from every single educator, there's so much love for teachers. I'm diverting Alberto, so please watch me, I'm diverting, but this experience of just talking to voters and talking to folks out in the streets and just having conversations, there's so much love for public school teachers. So just really know that. Sometimes it feels like we get beat up on, but there's so many people that believe in us and they vote for us. So just make sure you just say you're proud. I'm proud to be an educator, a teacher. Just know that. Real quick, I identify as African American. I really believe in a sense of African diaspora. African folks are sprinkled all around this country. We've been doing a lot of great things. You know, I don't try to get too much into the racialized identities as well. It's a challenge sometimes because it only limits us. So I ask everyone to be who you want to be and just enjoy who you are and, live that life to the fullest is the way I come. So I'm kind of get this camera right here. So yeah, that's who I am. Thank you.
Van Cedric. Daniel.
Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Robles. I teach 6th, 7th, and 8th grade Spanish and English language arts at the Cabrillo Unified School District in Half Moon Bay. I've been teaching since I began in immersion programs. I started out in elementary school and now I'm at the middle school. I've worked with the SOGIAC committee before. Currently, I'm on the Guy DeRosa Scholarship Committee, and I'm also on State Council, and I work with the Language Acquisition Committee, which is a great opportunity considering working with language-speaking learning models. It's great that CTA provides those avenues for us now. But I want to know, how do I identify? I feel like the word and also I'm humbled to be here with such great folk, hearing everyone's stories. It's like, oh, this is amazing. Thank you all for allowing us to be here. But thinking of identities, there's so many different ways to identify. First, I could say I'm male, which I feel kind of an odd relationship with, because while I recognize that I'm a man, I feel like maleness, the stereotype of what it means to be male, doesn't really describe who I am. So I feel it maybe might be better to say I'm a queer male, but even then I still feel the word male is not very comfortable for me all the time. So I'm comfortable with all pronouns as long as they're said with respect, but I know that I pass more as male in general. So I think that's how people would identify me. For me, I think it's also important to recognize my religion, my upbringing. I was raised Christian, and I think also as a queer individual, a lot of people have to fight for recognition within their faith to be able to say like, hey, I was raised with this. I still have a right to access it, and it still belongs to me just as much as it belongs to anybody else. So I very boldly and proudly say that I am a Christian, and a Pentecostal Christian specifically, because that one's like the more extreme and out there, and we need queer representation in Pentecostal circles. But besides that, I identify as Latino or Chicano, more specifically Chicano because I am Mexican American and I have a very Californian Mexican American experience. I was raised in the Central Valley of California in Delano and McFarland, so like right out here in the fields. I'm actually here by the fields right now. But so those are things that are really important, identities that are important to me: queer, Christian, Latino, Chicano, and yes, thank you all for having me.
Perfect. Thank you. So these are our amazing panelists today. I want you all to think about this question I'm going to ask. What are some terms that people often get wrong, don't understand, or are controversial in your community? So instead of calling on someone in this one, I want you to think of it, and then I'll take a hand. So again, what are some terms people often get wrong, don't understand, or are controversial in your community? Anybody want to go first?
Well, just off the top of my head, two words that are really confused or terms that are misunderstood often in my community. The first would be queer, coming from the LGBTQ perspective. The word itself is controversial even within the LGBTQ community. We've discussed it like at different CTA events with multi-generational folk. And a lot of times you'll see that some people are very uncomfortable with the word queer. It's been used as a derogatory term, but we see that like now a lot of the younger crowd is starting to embrace the word as a like kind of an all-encompassing word for the LGBTQ community and not necessarily as a specific identifier. And so I feel like that word often gets just, it's controversial even within our own community, whether or not people want to identify as queer, whether or not outsiders should be able to call us queer, things like that. All of that can be controversial. Moving on to like myself as a Latino, the term Latinx can be very controversial. For a lot of people, it can be controversial. Well, I feel like the camp is divided on two fields. There's people who see it as empowering because they might have a non-binary identity, or they might have problems with the patriarchal structure of the Spanish language, because the Spanish language, it does default to male. That is how the Spanish language works. And so it's a way to remediate that. And that's definitely something that's understandable. But then there's the other camp that feels that like Latinx, it sounds very like Americanized. It's English. It doesn't really work within the Spanish framework. So there's other terms that are similar to Latinx that come from Latin America that can easily adapt to Spanish. So these are words that's a term that's been very controversial for everybody. And I mean, to be honest, if I was to say Latino, which that itself is controversial, Latino is controversial. Hispanic is controversial. If you ever go to one of the Hispanic caucus meetings, you know that is a theme that comes up over and over and over again. How do we self-identify? And it seems like I keep saying that these terms that are really controversial have to do with identity. So I guess terms that identify us are really controversial for everyone in our community.
Perfect. Thank you, Daniel. Estella.
Yeah, so same. in the API community, it is the same. For a very long time, I mean, in the API community, you're taking, I don't know how many ethnicities, nationalities, and religions, and then trying to lump them into API, and that's what it is. And it doesn't work. And so I think as a collective, we are in the middle of a huge identity crisis along the lines of race, ethnicity, and nationality. And in some cases, nationality and ethnicity are kind of even more complicated or convoluted. As a Pacific Islander, I have never really felt a part of this API umbrella, but that's the box I gotta check on all these demographic lists. So as biracial, multi-ethnic, like all the terms are problematic. And I think the reason why all the terms are problematic is because not a single one of them are people, any of the communities our panelists represent tonight, we didn't make them up, right? Like all of these terms are in positionality or connection to our oppressors. And so in a lot of cases, none of these terms work. And so here we are battling over which term we should use, which term we shouldn't use, but we never got to name ourselves in so many cases. And so that's part of the issue that I think we're all facing. And the other thing is, as US folks living here and, you know, in this country, these borders, we have to also think about our positionality to race in a very different way that folks abroad may not consider or think about. And so terms like BIPOC, I feel like when folks in the API community push up against it, I often question and wonder, as a brown and Black API person, when I hear folks like, I don't like BIPOC, I wonder, is that anti-Blackness? And right now, am I safe in this space? Is my default or where I go to? And so I just keep reminding and try to remind the space that, like, we have to have those conversations where we are working to name ourselves, but at the same time recognize that here in the US, the race issue is very different from our ethnicities and our identities on a different level. And so it's a nuanced conversation, for sure, but to make it plain, there is a global caste system, and that caste system is based on the hue and shade of the color of my skin. And so we have to be very clear about that, because in all of our communities, there are folks who would fall at the bottom of that caste system, right? Within the Latino community, within the Native Indigenous community, some of our skin is darker and we face different challenges. And we have to have a very plain conversation about the color of our skin, which is different from how we identify ethnically or in terms of our, religion, nationality, gender, et cetera.
Thank you. That was awesome. Van Cedric.
Yeah, let me see if I can pick out a couple words. One of the things that and when I say my community, I'm more or less thinking about my teacher community. I just want to put it in that context. My union community as well. We talk about diversity. Diversity looks good. You have the sense of differing cultures of individuals, and they're part of this inclusive whole. But, really it kind of, to me, moves towards tokenism sometimes, because there's a structure that's already in place. There's an institution that's already in place. And by putting, whenever there's some social unrest, there usually is a person of color comes out and is the spokesperson, to kind of calm folks down. And so when you project an image of you having, this spectrum of diversity, but not very many individuals in that diversity spectrum actually have any power to make decisions. Right. And so we have to be really careful when we talk about, this is a diverse group. Well, if this is a diverse group, do each and every one of the individuals have the power to, move the systemic practices that are in place that either hold back or you can move it forward? Also, I think another one is, for me, that folks misunderstanding and are off a little bit, is about being anti-racist. There's a sense of I'm not racist because, I have a friend or I wear a T-shirt that says Black Lives Matter. And, I went to the social, marches over the summer, and I know this is wrong. But really, the sense of anti-racist is that your actions are, challenging the racist systems. That is dismantling what's creating these things, right? Just saying I'm not treating people racist is one thing, but you actually have to get involved and do something about it, right? And so it's looking at, when you're in a position of power, or if you're a supervisor, is really looking at, the practices that we have to see, are these systemic policies holding back folks, or am I using this to keep folks in place? And so you really have to challenge yourself when you say that I'm anti-racist, because just not being racist is not good enough. You actually have to put agency behind it. You have to actually be willing to move the issue forward and be willing to take that action. And I think sometimes folks are, want to be on the politically correct side, It's really like politically correctism. Is like, I'm not this way. So when they think about it, they're like, if you call me racist, I'm Donald Trump, right? But in between, there are so many different levels, on an everyday basis. There's microaggressions that occur every day with work, with folks. And so we really have to look at that and say, well, do I take the agency to challenge the racism that I see? And then you start moving forward to really address the issues that are out there. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Van Cedric. And yes, it's true. I think we need to move beyond that. Well, that's the way it's always been. That's how we do it. Challenge it. That's what our job is as educators, to challenge the system. Would someone like to go next?
I'll go next.
Mary. Okay.
Wow.
Thank you, Mary.
I will say I agree totally with what Daniel is saying. With one, we didn't name ourselves, and Estella, absolutely, the diversity part of who we are in our country. Coming from a Native Americanist perspective, I will say that something that we are starting to get away from is the term Indians, and moving away from that. And I agree with Van Cedric that, you don't feel like you're in power, but yet as educators, we do have that power to make that huge change, to make those vocabulary and make that change different for a new generation. So are we the lucky ones that we get to make that change? Yes, we'll suffer through, but I think so. We, as the Native American community, has never named themselves. It was always the government coming in and were declaring that your tribe is called this, or you're called this because we heard you saying this, or because, for example, Navajo. We heard other people describing you as Navajo, and so now we are going to call you Navajo. And it wasn't until they empowered themselves to describe, we are no longer going to be called Navajo, we are now going to be called Dene, or the Dene Nation. And so it is back on tribes now that are saying, wait a minute, we're going back and this is who we are. Ohlone is Ohlone because they call themselves Ohlone. But you look at Wilson Rancheria is a tribe, but their people are Miwok. And so it was because government came in and said, we got to name you, and this is the space you're occupying, and so we're going to name you that space. So when we look around, and that's the beauty of the land acknowledgement, when we look at our land acknowledgement and we look at those people, it's our eyes now that see and acknowledge who they were, who walked those lands and who they were. They weren't a rancheria at the time because they've been there long before that. And so, and I guess, you go into tribal versus government names. And so when we do that, that's why land acknowledgement, as I said, is so important. But it's also the fact that Miwok, Hopi, Kauai, Ohlone, those titles of those people mean something because it's a mind, it's their mind, it's the way they walk the lands, it's the way they think every single day, it's the way they view the world, and their relationship to that land and their relationship to people. And what's the controversy? Controversy is indigenous. Indigenous is a little bit of a controversy because it's a very overbroad, widespread of not just our little area, but it's like north. It could be indigenous of South Africa, it could be indigenous of New Zealand, it could be indigenous anywhere. So when you get an indigenous, it becomes very broad. So when you bring up the word BIPOC, and you wonder how much do I fit in there? Because it's so broad. And so, but it, again, I guess it's the space you occupy when you have that conversation. So that's where I am. I see that stick out. I'm just like, I gotta wrap it up.
Thank you, Mary. Nicole, if you'd like to wrap us up from this section.
Okay. I first I will say thank you very much, because some of the comments that you all made helped me to think and like reaffirm the language we use in our classrooms, right? Like that just took me right back to my day, and how I'm describing the different elements of the day, different people and stuff like that. When we have these different conversations, it's absolutely important. And from my LGBTQ perspective, like it's absolutely important that yes, I have the rainbow back here on the wall. You know, this is my setup. This is what my kids look at all day with me. And I do that because as much as we talk about, it's important for students to be able to see people of color in front of them, especially when they are of color, right? If we talk about like so my classroom, my students are identified mostly as Latino, as we have Latino, Asian, and there's a few different Asian groups, and Black, and we have a large immigration of Afghan, and I know I'm missing. Oh, I have a Tongan student, so linguistically. So and this year in my class, I have one student who is phenotypically white, but he already told me that he identifies as Native, you know, and he is part Native, so Native American. So, you know, my students, when they look at me, it's important, like to me, to be a good role model as a positive LGBTQ person, as a positive white person who is understanding and respectful of who they are, their communities. We get into conversations all the time about politics and like the presidential election. Wow, we lit it up. But when I start talking about like terms that are controversial in my community, I mean, honestly, sometimes with my students, remember, I teach 4th, 5th. So sometimes I have to tell my students it's okay to say the word gay when you use it in a certain context, because I've had students say before, oh, well, he's G-A-Y. Like they're not, because of their family, they know that gay is a bad word. So I have to be that positive representation that like, no, it's not, you know, and it does tend to be, it can be a hidden community. It just depends. I tend to be very out loud. So one of the terms that like I had written down, I wrote down queer. Thank you, Daniel. You handle it very well. The other thing that I was thinking of, two things I was thinking of specifically right now. One that is very, that we hear a lot is the controversy around using they as a singular. And I mean, it's gotten to the point where I believe it's even in the dictionary now. And it's being said that, you know, it is okay. And I know that it's super uncomfortable. And as language evolves, it's uncomfortable to use the new language. But if somebody prefers the pronoun they, or if somebody prefers a pronoun that there are also a couple of other pronouns that people use sometimes instead of they might use XI or like ZE, right? And it's also the same idea, which is they're preferring not to identify with a specific gender. So I would say that that's a controversial term, and obviously I could talk about it a little bit more. But the other one I do want to say before I leave, which is at this time, we use the term transgender, not transgendered, like with the ED. That's an old term. Same thing if people use like cross-dresser and some of those other, like there are some really old terms that every once in a while I'll hear somebody use and it's just, okay, you know, and that's an opportunity for me to, or people to maybe try to talk with them and say, hey, you know, that's something we used to use. This is what we use now. And just educate and move forward and not try to get offended and make it a big deal, but just try to educate and move forward. Same thing, just real quick, I know my time's up, but if somebody does prefer to not have a specific pronoun used for them, When we do, because I do often, sometimes I'll end up using the wrong, and I'll end up saying, oh, she this, and I'll catch myself. And what I'll make sure is well, they, or I'll use their name and then repeat the sentence so that I say it correctly and then continue to move on. I'm not going to sit there and apologize and like spend a whole bunch of time on that, because that's not the point. Just at least to go back and acknowledge, like, and use it correctly, or at least like catch myself in my head, and then make sure that the next sentence when I'm talking about them, if I use a pronoun, I make sure I use the correct pronoun, or I just avoid pronouns and use their name. So that's what I add to the conversation.
Thank you, Nicole. And yeah, I think it is true. As educators, we even need to ensure that our colleagues are doing this. Sometimes they will, well, it's easier for me to say it this way, or they put their own beliefs on things. And if a child, identities are not simple things. Everyone identifies differently. So you have to respect the person's choice of how they choose to identify. So if they want to use they, then you're not going to say, well, but they look like a girl. Well, they want to be referred to as they. So I think it's important for us to teach our colleagues, especially some that are stuck in their ways. I mean, I think that's our job, to continue learning just how our students do as well. Okay, so moving into the next section, what are some terms or concepts that you think bring people together, you wish people used more, or you wish people understood better? So terms or concepts that you think bring people together, you wish people used more, or you wish people understood better. Estella.
I don't, the one about bringing folks together, I'm actually stumped and not sure, but I feel like there's a whole long list of words we should like know, and be clear that there's no like different definition for it. You know what I mean? Like, racism is racism. White supremacy is white supremacy. Equity is equity. Like, these aren't things that are up for debate. I don't need to pull out like my Britannica series and have a dialogue about it. Like, these words exist, they've got definitions, and we just need to make it plain. And like Nicole is saying, like, educate and move forward so that we can get to the good stuff, the conversations that might be really healing about naming ourselves, you know what I mean, in our smaller collectives, and then as a whole, just being very clear on what intersectionality is, what race is, what ethnicity is, what is inclusion and diversity. These are defined terms, right? Like, we don't have to debate about them anymore. And so I hope maybe it's as simple as typing up a glossary and just disseminating the glossary and then moving on from there. As an API or Pacifica person, I hope, or I want it as a mixed person, biracial person, I should say, I would like for other API folk to recognize that the language that you use often a lot of times feels really anti-Black, really gross and racist. And specifically in the Samoan community, there's a term that is used, matauli, which is akin to the N-word. And we don't often have conversations about it, but it's used a lot. And that's not the correct term. Now, in some cases, it could just be, language issue. Like, Samoan is not an easy language to learn. I'm trying to learn now. It's rough, but that's a term that we've got to let go. The proper term would be tangata uli, so Black people, as opposed to Black things, right? Or another term that often I got called a lot as a kid is palangi, which I also know Black folks, especially African kids, we grow up getting called like Oreo. So I got Oreo or coconut, you know what I mean? Like, oh, you pronounce the ing on the end of the word. What's wrong with you? And so those were like slurs that I get called often. So either in the API community, it was, palangi, which is I guess the equivalent to palangi is like calling someone a gringo, or matauli, and then in Black spaces being othered as well, because I'm biracial or mixed, and there's no place in between. But I do want to just like, I want those words, and I think I saw it in the chat. Someone's already got a glossary. See, we're good. So, and then the last thing I'll say is, I see the stick. I think I said it already, but I want to make it plain. Like, it isn't a conversation about oppression Olympics, and I hope that no one ever feels like that when we are having really candid and really like hard conversations. But here in the US, like, we have to fix that, right? Like, we're here talking about race in the US and understanding that our liberation as a whole is inextricably tied to Black people and Native people in this country. Like, period, point blank. That's the history of this country. And so I just want to be very like clear about that, and I hope I'm not the only one who thinks that way out there.
Thank you. Any of our other panelists want to go next? Nicole.
I don't want to wait and be last this time. So I had a hard time with this one, and I thought about this for a little bit. And I guess the thing that I would like to, and I'm continuing to work on this, and I was thinking about it as we were talking about it, is just gendering in general. And like with my students, sometimes like when my students give answers and I'm like, yeah, he's right, and I use a pronoun, and honestly, most of my students in 4th grade are not having conflict with their gender, and they're definitely not saying it. But there are kids, and there will be some of my students who either they themselves have questions about their gender, or somebody close to them will. And so they'll have to think about it and like process it. And so any of those places where you see that people try to use non-binary, non-gender terms, if you can link that into your conversation, I hear so often like the beginning of a CTA speech, hello, brothers and sisters. And it's like, technically, you're leaving some people out. As much as you're trying to embrace and make it seem like this whole family thing, you just left some people out. And you may not have meant to, but it happens. And if you don't include, you are by default excluding. And so, it's better if you, I was looking at a little list of stuff, and instead of boys and girls, like some of my favorites, I say kiddos a lot, but granted, I do teach 4th and 5th. My principal prefers scholars, of course, and then I think though that you can look at, and there are plenty of lists, but depending on what you're talking about, like there are a ton of terms. I also really like, and sometimes someone said to me one time, they were just like, you are an amazing human. And I was just like, thank you. And because we had never had a conversation about what my gender was and how I identify. And that would be another thing I would say, because we have spoken so much about gender identity and pronouns and such. Don't be afraid to ask somebody. That is honestly the most respectful you can be, is to ask somebody. And I'm not talking about how do they identify as race. I'm talking about how do you identify as your gender? What would you prefer? What pronouns would you prefer me to use? And you ask that simple question. For somebody who it matters and it means something to, it's going to mean the world. For most of the other people, they're going to be like, oh, well, I identify as she, or he, or they'll just say some, how they feel, and it won't be a big deal. But for those who it does matter, it really is going to matter. So please don't be afraid to say and ask, and then use it.
Perfect. Thank you, Nicole. I saw Mary had her hand up next.
I want to say, like, I'm with Estella, because with I never really thought about what's the term that we bring all people together, but I know that terms like, when you're grouping together and you're going to, fight a struggle, that, what do you call yourselves all together? Or do you go in as individual terms. And so that's why, when I said indigenous, is one of those controversial terms. That's why, and then it leads into, like BIPOC, which are Black, Indigenous, people of color. And yes, somehow, some way, we do need to have terms, I guess, to come together. But why not also know that we're all in, how each one of our struggles add to that fight that we want. And so when we lump everybody together, then it becomes one. I'm not quite sure, because that's my struggle, I guess. That's me with that term. And then it's like we went from people of color to Black, Indigenous people of color to what's the next? And is it a hot issue now? Will it still be that with our next generation, or is it a long lasting? I mean, because what I'm seeing is some of our terms are generational, and they keep evolving as we go through. And so I'm not sure where I am right now, because I'm still, grasping with those terms too. So that's kind of where I am.
Perfect. Thank you, Mary. Van Cedric.
Yeah, I have three terms that I just want to keep plugging and putting out there. And first one is Black Lives Matter, right? Like, educators for Black lives. Like, just saying that, right, has been a struggle for many people. But I think that is a term that brings folks together, because one, it's a historical acknowledgement that Black lives have been devalued throughout history. So to be bold, why you have to be bold, but to be bold enough and courageous to say Black Lives Matter, right, really tends to acknowledge that there's been a history of devaluation. Just imagine this. It's only been 150 years since folks were out of slavery, Black folks were out of slavery. It's only been 50 years since they got the Voting Rights Act. And through all that time, there's been institutional discrimination and all of this stuff, right? And now we're at this point to say Black lives do matter. And two, I'm a history teacher and I teach 11th grade US history. And I for my first, few years, I really was so focused on teaching to the test. We were teaching out of the textbook, and the textbook devalues Black lives. And so we've had an educational system over the past 100 years that have devalued ethnicities in general, Black folks in general. So now that we're reclaiming that, I think that is awesome. I think that brings us together because it allows everyone to claim their identity, their ethnic identity as well. And two, ethnic studies is part of curriculum. Mm-hmm. We want to make sure that continues to become a normal, vocabulary of exchange amongst educators. And as we as educators spread it out to the world, it just becomes part of identifying so many of our folks who are in this country, immigrants who have contributed to this country, right? We have to acknowledge that. And many times we get so caught up in our own individual selves, we forget to acknowledge others. And so I think both of those terms continue to build on us growing our capacity as Americans, as educators, as people. And my last one is intersectionality. Stella mentioned that before. I think there's a complexity to intersectionality, like looking at race and class and gender, and looking at the power structure of how one actually identifies themselves, or see how all these things have created the person, or created the obstacles, or created, I think it's a multi-level terminology that really allows us to look at the complexity of identity and the complexity of power and complexity of institutional structure that's created the outcomes that we see. And it no longer allows us to simplify it. Actually, we have to kind of go a little deeper. So I really love those three terms that we're in this place in 2020, going into 2021, that we are growing our capacity to use our imagination to be more than what, as Stella says, like more than what we've been told that we were, that was created for us. We actually are breaking out of that mold and just really engaging deeper conversations about who we are. I love it. I love it. And I think that brings us together, right? Because now when I sit in with my other friends, we start talking about intersectionality, and it just like, man, it just goes on and on and on. So I really love those conversations. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. And Daniel, if you'd like to close us out with this section.
All right. So as I was sharing earlier, like my experience is Chicano. I was not born in Mexico, so my experience is very Mexican American, but I had the fortune of getting to do part of my credential in Mexico, and that opened my eyes to a lot of things that I didn't know about Mexican culture. And something that really stuck out at me, a phrase, so I'm just going to go respond to the idea of a concept that should be more understood, was that there was something that was said by Benito Juarez, the first Native American president of Mexico. He was Zapoteco from Oaxaca. And the specific phrase is, entre los individuos como entre las naciones, el respeto al derecho ajeno es la paz, which once I heard that for the first time, it was like, whoa, that is so all-encompassing. If we translate it to English, it means amongst individuals as between nations, respect for the rights of others is peace. And I feel that what we see so often is that people think that the rights of others belong to them. And so when they're like, oh no, this is not something I agree with, they're just focusing on someone else's rights and they're not focusing on their own lives. And I feel that a concept that needs to be more understood by most of us is that we need to respect the rights of others. We need to not try to lord it over other people's lives, because when we try to make other people conform to what we want the world to be, instead of making sure that everybody has freedom to be who they want to be, we're ruining peace. Whether it's our peace or whether it's their peace, we're ruining peace. And that's something that I feel we should definitely continue to work on.
I like it.
Wow. Thank you. So that is the basically the questions I had for our panelists. So thank you to all of our panelists for that amazing Takeover Tuesday. Before we end, we have a few announcements for you. So the first one is, if you would like to present at the Equity and Human Rights Conference, which will be held virtually, you can still do so. The conference will be held February 24th through the 27th. The deadline to submit session applications is this Friday, November 20th. If you would like to register for the CTA LGBTQ+ Issues Conference, that will be December 3rd through 5th. Registration is open for that, so you can register. If you would like to sign up for upcoming Takeover Tuesdays, there will be the bit.ly in the chat. And our final announcement, we would love to hear feedback on what you thought of our Tuesday Takeover today, and to suggest future speakers or topics. So we have those links in the chat. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you again to our panelists. You were amazing.
Nice job, everyone.
Thank you. And if anyone's wondering why their camera's not working, it's because it's a WebEx event. So it's similar to CTA State Council, where only the panelists are on. That's why we can't see each other, but we're sending you all virtual hugs. Thank you for joining us.